2014 has come and gone, and yet another year has been filled with first-person games. So once again, join me as I take a look at some of the releases we got over the last 12 months. Like last year, I feel I should point out that whilst I would really like to be able to play every single game that comes out, that's just not going to happen. Also, there are other games that just didn't warrant all that much attention for whatever reason. So if there's a game I do not talk about, chances are I either didn't play it or don't think it's worth talking about in the first place. Either way, don't take it personally. If you'd like to see a first-person game reviewed in the future, feel free to drop a comment about it in the comments section below. Anyway, having said that, let's get into it. Much like 2013, 2014 didn't have the best start for the first-person genre. The first notable release of the year was the Rambo game, developed by Techland. This game tried to recreate a lot of the iconic scenes from the films, and it did kind of work on that level, but it suffered from some downright horrible shooting and just flat-out boring design, hindered by its on-rails playstyle. Ever play that game Super Slam Hunting Alaska? Yeah, same deal. Not a very good looking, sounding, or even a fun game to play at any stretch, and with a 2-hour-long length, this one wasn't worth enlisting for. The next big release for the year didn't really fare all that better. In early March, we got the Thief reboot, headed up by Square Enix, who previously did a great effort with Deus Ex Human Revolutions. Now, the Thief reboot did get some things right. It had gorgeous dynamic lighting, a somewhat interesting art style, and I actually thought that the new Garrett character was pretty likable.
Careful, Garrett. There are worse things in the shadows than you.
But it all revolved around a really generic and boring storyline featuring unlikable characters and just needless profanity. They did try to open up the city a bit more, giving you lots of side missions and activities to complete, but this was ruined by how needlessly difficult it was to navigate, and also the slow, cumbersome looting animation that would accompany every single little item you picked up that made the stealing just very tedious. All this game served to do was remind us of how brilliant the original games were. Luckily, in late March, we got our first half-decent shooting game with the release of Titanfall. Now, Titanfall was kind of described as Call of Duty with mechs, and that's really not too far from the truth. It was, for the most part, your standard online ranked multiplayer shooter, though it had two vastly different playstyles, depending on whether or not you're on foot or piloting one of the Titans. On foot, you could double jump, slide along walls, and do all kinds of cool-looking parkour moves, whilst in the Titan suits, shooting became a lot more strategic and methodical when against other Titans, and you also still had to contend with enemies on foot who could take you down with anti-Titan weaponry. I can't talk about the game of late though because I stopped playing it months ago, but on release, this was a great game with great combat. Not too long after this, Deus Ex The Fall was released for Microsoft Windows. Now, this was originally a mobile game featuring lots of gameplay mechanics from Deus Ex Human Revolution, and for all intensive purposes, The Fall is literally just the mobile version ported to the PC. A lot of people hammered this game for its subpar visuals and rehashed gameplay, and yeah, it's a mobile port and all that, but it is for the most part just a watered down version of Human Revolution, and I found it as equally enjoyable. It was painfully short, however roughly 3 or 4 hours long, but it was also the first in a planned series of games, and for its cheap price tag, it's not the worst thing you could throw money at. Rounding up March, we got Bioshock Burial at Sea Episode 2 and a very cool game called Betrayer, developed by Black Powder Games, a team of guys who worked on No One Lives Forever and the Fear series. In Betrayer, you're lost in 17th century America with some basic weaponry to defend yourself with, fighting zombified Spaniard soldiers as you carried out a series of investigations, where you convened with ghosts in a spirit world to unlock a series of clues that explained everyone's disappearance. With very little hand-holding, Betrayer had a downright spooky atmosphere and some really cool visuals, featuring a basic stealth system and some satisfying combat against the numerous zombie soldiers that are constantly chasing the player. If you don't mind a game that offers very little player assistance, then Betrayer might be something worth looking into. And then finally for March, we got Burial at Sea Episode 2, which was the second and final installment in the Bioshock Infinite DLC series. In Episode 2, you played as a version of Elizabeth with all of her powers stripped away from her, stranded in Rapture shortly before the events that transpired in the first Bioshock game. The gameplay was very much stealth-based, with Elizabeth able to use a crossbow with all manner of non-lethal ammunition to take down enemies. Much different from practically every other game in the series, it had a much greater focus on the storyline and did its best to wrap up all the loose ends, bringing the series to its conclusion. On the highest difficulty, the stealth was satisfyingly challenging and there were a few good tearjerkers in the narrative, so overall, this wasn't too bad. Now, we're pretty much used to seeing Minecraft clones nowadays, and a month or so later in April, we got a Minecraft clone called Far Sky. However, Far Sky had one important difference. It takes place completely underwater. In Far Sky, you're a diver whose submarine was destroyed and you have to survive by collecting resources and rebuilding your submarine. You have a base of operations where you can upgrade and build new gear, and outside you have to contend with sharks, barracuda, and you're always diminishing air supply. I can't really recommend this game enough. It was simple to pick up and very addictive. The first time I played it, the next thing I knew it was 1 AM in the morning. Very few games can offer up that kind of immersion, and even fewer for the price tag.
Nazi scum.
In May, we got the release of the highly anticipated Wolfenstein The New Order. I'm sure I'm not the only one who grew up playing Wolfenstein 3D, and just being able to play Wolfenstein in any form was a terrific feeling. Luckily, The New Order was pretty damn awesome. Taking place in an alternate timeline where the Nazis won the Second World War, you take on the role of BJ Blazkowicz, waking up after a 10 or so year long coma to find himself in a world totally alien to him. From there, you team up with the Resistance and bring the Nazis down once and for all. Now, The New Order tried to sell itself off as an old school shooter, and the only thing that it really did in that regard was using the traditional health and armor system. But still, it was a great shooting game with satisfying gunplay. Letting loose with dual auto shotguns or any of the game's explosive weapons made for some great eye candy. It had its issues, mostly related to the content. I mean, there was lots of innocent people getting brutally gunned down and tortured in the storyline, but this was still one of the best shooting games of 2014 and had an intense, visceral and downright lengthy campaign that is worth checking out for any FPS fan. In late May, there were a couple of noteworthy early access titles released on Steam, and these were Rogue Shooter, the FPS roguelike, and Heavy Bullets. Rogue Shooter was a great 90s shooter homage with strong Corridor 7 influences. It featured lots of creative weapons, but very simplistic and somewhat boring level design, consisting of narrow hallways where enemies could easily pounce and overpower the player. But I would say this is worth checking out if you're a fan of games of a similar theme from the 90s. Everyone else though should just give this one a miss. Heavy Bullets, on the other hand, was a procedurally generated shooter where you move through a series of floors representing the insides of a computer system as you killed all manner of viruses. Enemies would drop coins when killed, which you could use to upgrade your weapon, health, movement speed, and so forth. Items could also be carried, which would give you passive or one-off benefits, and you're able to save money in a bank across playthroughs. Heavy Bullets was a very difficult game to come to grips with, but also very fun to play and ultimately satisfying when everything clicked. If you see this one in a Steam sale, don't think twice, just get it. Moving on into the second half of the year, June was pretty uneventful, though we did get a really crappy World War II game called Enemy Front. Enemy Front was just so uninspired and half-assed, it felt like a game that was developed in autopilot mode. In Enemy Front, you play as a wartime journalist named Robert Hawkins who undertakes a series of missions throughout France during the Second World War. The concept was at least somewhat solid. It used the Crysis 3 engine and adopted a similar style of gameplay, giving the player large environments where they could presumably take any approach to the objectives that they wanted, be it stealth or guns blazing. However, this idea went out the window after the first or so mission when the illusion of choice evaporated and it just became your standard shooter, where you spent all the time in combat shooting the same looking enemies over and over, in between waiting for your health to regenerate. Boring as hell. July was another quiet month. The only real thing worth mentioning was another early access title called Lich Tom Battle Mage. Taking a page out of games like Hexen and Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, Lich Tom puts you into the shoes of a male or female spellcaster, offering up a robust spellcrafting mode and hordes of undead bad guys to kill along the way. In early access, this was a somewhat confusing game to get the hang of, but when you finally grasped the concept, it was pretty enjoyable melting skeletons and bandits with AoE bombs. Gorgeous visuals, cinematic soundtrack, and a neat concept. Not a bad game. August was a very controversial month as it heralded the release of Five Nights at Freddys. Now, this was one of the most polarizing games I think got released all year. People either loved or hated it. The concept was pretty unique. You were a security guard in a haunted children's pizza-themed restaurant, and you had to avoid being killed by evil animatronics. Now, the game was pure YouTuber bait, but it was full of terrifying jump scares and a very foreboding and frightening atmosphere, and all to think it was developed by one person. People ripped this game to shreds, but for its dirt cheap price tag and entertainment value, it's hard to fault. Months later, the sequel was released as well, which wasn't as good, mostly because it just felt a little bit rushed, but it was still fun as hell to play, more so if you did it with the second person. There's really not that much stuff to get through in either of these games. I mean, you'll really only get a good 3 or 4 hours gameplay tops, but if you play through it with a friend like I said, it can be very entertaining. There were 2 other notable indie games released in August I want to talk about as well, and these were Ziggurat and Lovely Planet. Ziggurat is a randomly generated arena-style shooter with a strong heretic and hexen vibe. With the lightning-fast movement speed and old-school strafing mechanics, this was a great throwback to older, fantasy-themed shooting games and had a very appealing art style. I first took a look at this game when it was in early access, and I also revisited it recently to see how much has changed. Well, the diversity with rooms and other environments is now much better. There's new weapons and items to collect, as well as an assortment of new gameplay features like a shrine you can approach to gain perks. The game is also a lot more difficult now with all the new stuff they've crammed into it, but it's still worth checking out. Lovely Planet, on the other hand, is about as far removed from Ziggurat as I think is humanly possible. It's a very Japanese-inspired game where you bounce around different levels in a platforming fashion and kill evil-looking cubes with a laser gun. It felt more like a fleshed-out flesh game than a PC game, but it was colourful and catchy with a fantastic soundtrack. These are 2 very cheap and fun games, definitely worth taking a look at.
Find the Black Garden. Rip out its heart. Only then will your traveler begin to heal.
Finally, moving towards the end of 2014, we got some of the big guns: Destiny, Borderlands, Alien Isolation, and Call of Duty Advanced Warfare. Destiny was the first one out of the gate. Developed by Bungie, it was a large open-world FPS game where you played the role of a Guardian, one of the defenders of Earth, set at some point after a post-apocalyptic event that saw humanity on the brink of extinction. With a huge cast of voice actors, Destiny was the very embodiment of a AAA game, and for the most part, it was great fun to play, especially in co-op. The only issue was that it just felt very uninspired and it lacked any real soul. The social component of the game was very poorly implemented, and a lot of the missions, in fact every single mission, just concluded with having to fight waves and waves of enemies. After the campaign was finished, the game devolved into a grindfest, replaying certain events over and over to unlock bits of legendary gear one piece at a time. It had all the hallmarks of a Bungie game, right down to the placement of the weapon crosshair on the screen. And I think overall it is worth playing, it's just a shame that it could have been so much more. Next up was Alien Isolation, a brilliant first-person survival horror game that kind of surprised everyone with just how awesome it turned out to be. You take on the role of Ellen Ripley's daughter Amanda, investigating into the reasons behind her disappearance. Amanda soon ends up on a space station overrun by a glitchy AI system and a lone alien that's killed the majority of the station's inhabitants. Fantastically paced, Alien Isolation was a game that had you constantly on the run from the lone xenomorph, avoiding attacking androids and murderous marauders as you moved through the photorealistic space station. What few weapons you had was marred by limited ammunition, and the tension was also heightened by a very traditional manual save system. With some good headphones and a low light setting, this game was immersive as hell, and it's arguably the best first-person game of the year. Borderlands The PreSequel graced us with its presence shortly after, released towards the end of October. For all intensive purposes, this was really just Borderlands 2 DLC with a strong Aussie vibe to the writing.
I think it was him, unless it was a her.
Even if that vibe was periodically ruined by the abysmal humour of Anthony SJW Birch.
I'll let you into the next area!
Taking place on Pandora's Moon, the planet featured in the previous game, it was a prequel to the events of Borderlands 2, and let you choose from one of the 4 new classes as you carried out missions for Handsome Jack, back when he was just a simple Hyperion employee. The only real new innovations were the air supply system and the double jump, coupled with some new elemental weapon types. For the most part though, this was a great game, even if it did suffer from the same balancing issues as the other games, and with little change in terms of overall gameplay. If you can get a co-op game going, it can be very entertaining, and it also runs like a dream on most PCs.
Let's put it!
Lastly, in November, we got the final two heavyweights of the year. They were Call of Duty Advanced Warfare and Far Cry 4. Advanced Warfare was pretty much what we've come to expect from COD games, a largely rehashed multiplayer mode with an entirely new single-player campaign that will roughly take you 5 or so hours to get through. This time around, the main character, voiced by Troy Baker, playing himself of course, works for a powerful philanthropist called Jonathan Irons, with his combat abilities soon augmented by something called an exosuit, giving him the ability to jump really high, pull a riot shield out of his ass and punch stuff really hard. Okay, so I'm being a bit of a dick here, and to be honest, I really enjoyed Advanced Warfare, at least the single player. Kevin Spacey was adapted into the game as Jonathan Irons, and he gave a really damn good performance as the game's antagonist. The various powers you were given from wearing exosuits in the game were fun to play around with, and when the game wasn't suffering from mouse lag, it looked gorgeous. The problem with Call of Duty is that its shelf life is limited by whether or not you're invested in the multiplayer, which I am not. It just didn't offer up enough new content or mechanics to make it worthwhile, and the fact that it had barely 20,000 something people online, even at release, was the final nail in the coffin. Far Cry 4, on the other hand, was a game that offered up loads of depth and length if you don't mind doing the same side mission 50 odd times. Very much Far Cry 3.5 rather than Far Cry 4, it was another game like Borderlands The PreSequel that felt more like DLC than a full-blown sequel. Set in the Himalayas, you played a young native named Ajay returning to his homeland to end the reign of vicious dictator and overall awesome guy Pagan Min, again voiced by Troy Baker. Anyway, what this meant was driving around a humongous open world, taking over outposts and climbing radio towers whilst collecting loot and other crap along the way, as you periodically complete story missions to claim the area back from Min's forces. The story wasn't all that interesting, mostly because the main characters were just huge dickheads, but just going out into the wilderness and killing corrupt soldiers and the local fauna was the absolute tits. Far Cry 4 suffered from lots of optimization issues, connection dropouts, and it was a bit of a bitch to get running, but in terms of games that just give you free reign to cause constant mayhem in a lush bush setting, it's unmatched. Finally, there were the other smaller games in 2014 that didn't get recognition and I still think are worth checking out. One of these is Rack, a pseudo old school / arcade shooter with a soundtrack by Bobby Prince and a very Quake 2 inspired art style. In Rack, you go around shooting bad guys for points whilst building up a score multiplier to let off devastating finishing moves. It was a good mix of the old and the new and definitely worth playing. The other game is Time Rifters, a neat concept where you play various stages 4 times and each playthrough you're helped by your previous attempt, which you can see in the game world carrying out your previous actions. This was a really cool idea and implemented very well. I wish both of these games were a bit longer, but still, these are two great titles I think everyone should look into. And so I guess that's kind of it for 2014. Let me just take this opportunity to once again thank everyone for watching my videos and supporting my channel. Last year when I made the 2013 retrospective, I said I had something like 1,600 subscribers. Now I've reached 12,000. I just still can't believe that there's so many people in this world who like listening to what I have to say. I mean, this channel started out as a hobby and the only real reason I'm still doing it at this point is because I enjoy seeing so many like-minded people chatting about these older and newer games that we all know and love. But anyway, I'll stop being sentimental and just say thanks once again. I hope all you guys have a Merry Christmas, New Year, and all that shit. I'll see you all in 2015.